welcome back up to the Vinyl Attic for another episode of Vinyl Fetish, where we are counting through, not up or down, but through 100 albums that matter, 100 albums that should be in your record collection, at least according to me. I might have said this, I've worked in record stores. I worked in 4 record stores at a Atlanta chain called Turtles for many years in the 1980s. I worked in the music business. And I've assembled a lot of vinyl over the years. So I feel somewhat qualified as a sociology professor, but more importantly as a music fanatic to kind of give you my take on the essentials in your collection. And I'm really excited. This is one of those albums that was so important to me. We're going to be talking about Gary Numan's 1979 album, The Pleasure Principle. 1979 comes out in November of 1979. Actually, it's his second album of 1979. In 1979, earlier that year in April, he released his second album, Replicas, with the Two-Boy Army. And while that record was still kind of rising up the charts, it eventually made it to number 1. The single did, Our Friends Electric. He was already working on this record, so very productive. It's important because of how it shifts the way we think about the future. So let me just say, first of all, the cover is kind of a little indicator. This is sort of a recreation of a Rene Magritte painting called The Pleasure Principle, but a more technological take on Magritte's famous painting. The title, The Pleasure Principle, is also something that's associated with Dr. Sigmund Freud and the notion of the id and being driven by the pursuit of pleasure, which kind of ties into this warped picture. In the 1970s, we were, if you think of the 70s and the music of the 70s, I mean, if I were to pick one band that represented the 70s, it might be Crosby, Stills, and Nash and Young. Just kind of crunchy, acoustic-y, like the come down from the 60s and the organic stuff that was happening. But behind that was a rise of electronic music. Groups like Kraftwerk, for example, were ascended. And what Numan does with this record is he really sort of presents electronic music as something that can be presentable to the mainstream and have hits and be played on the radio and things like that. When it came out, Robert Christgau called it a metal machine music, an easy listening version of Lou Reed's metal machine music, meaning it was kind of a coming together of something that was sort of way underground and something that could be more commercial. On this album, he kind of disbanded his band, the Two-Boy Army, and went straight for synthesizer-based music, no guitars whatsoever. Brought in this great drummer named Cedric Sharpley, who gave a little bit of an organic sound to this record. And out of it comes this robotic picture of the world. It is very Blade Runner. It is very forward-looking. I have to tell you, as a kid in the late 70s going into the 1980s, the perception was, and we were still really thinking that decades had distinct sort of cultural ethos. The 60s were the 60s and the 70s were crunchy, and that the 80s were going to be very driven by technology. And so, like, one of the dominant things I remember at the turn of the decade was the role neon played. Like, things that were sort of cold and electronic were seen as, we're getting close to Orwell's 1984. Everything is about to sort of change away from the hippy-dippy vibe. And so this record was essentially, even though it comes out late 79, it's sort of the dawn of the 80s ethos of technology. And it's all about the alienation of technology. It's about being a robot in this world of mechanical engineering and having this dystopian picture of films, of cars, of sort of all the things around us. And it begs the question, I mean, I remember first hearing this record, even before the single Cars, which sort of everybody knows that song, or you should know that song, kind of started coming out on the charts and being played on radio, of being frightened by it. Like, what is this, the future? It's so detached and so remote, and his voice is so monotone. It's not a lot of, like, vibrato. There's no vibrato, and there's no really up or down melodic gymnastics. It ain't Beyonce. So I almost said Mariah Carey, which would be the extreme version of that. It's like Mariah Carey's at one end of the spectrum and Gary Numan is at the other end of the spectrum. That was a little frightening about what this world holds for us as we move into this new decade that's gonna be so dictated by our relationship to technology. The question behind that, though, especially when I bought this record when it came out, 15 years old, almost 16, bought this record and listened to it incessantly, was there's a lot of soul behind it. There is a lot of sort of human emotion about the human trapped in the machine. Later, we would think of it as the ghost in the machine, that there's this human element that's struggling in this encroaching world of technology. And this record perfectly captures that. The second single from the album, the first one did really well. In fact, it was #1 in Canada. The second single from the album, Complex, was, had violins and violas in it, and it was almost sort of like a not a ballad, but sort of a plaintive blues about living in a world where humanity is disappearing. And it was actually, made it to #8 on the British singles charts. I mean, it resonated with people on some level. There's this technology that's used on it, like the mini Moog, that would then become part of sort of the mainstream music of the 80s and kind of the MTV music of the 80s. Like, a lot of this instrumentation just became sort of, de rigueur, as they would say. I mean, Depeche Mode is directly influenced, and a lot of the new romantic movement of the bands of the 1980s, like OMD, are directly a product of the popularity of Gary Numan's use of these synthesizers to kind of paint a detached picture of the world. His music has been sampled. It's had a huge influence, including in hip-hop. It pops up in a lot of hip-hop. It pops up in a lot of kind of industrial music. In fact, Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails, who covered the song Metal off this album with Gary Numan on it, has talked a lot about how the pleasure principle was a huge influence on his way of thinking about music. And, of course, now he's, a Oscar-nominated, Golden Globe Award-winning soundtrack guy. Coming from thinking about electronics the way that Gary Numan thought about it, as a way of kind of bridging the gap between technology and human. Hip-hop has used it. Sort of electronic dance music has really built on Gary Numan. I mean, the most obvious one that people will know is Basement Jaxx, Where's Your Head At, which was such a great banger in the clubs. I mean, Where's Your Head At pretty much just lifts a big old riff off of this album. In fact, this record had a real minimalist approach where there's no guitars on it, there's no solos, there's no, extraneous music. It's just synthesizers, keyboards, and drums. Would create a kind of aesthetic for music of the early 80s. And the idea of just really stripping things down. And then behind that kind of electronic veneer, there would be some real clear messages about alienation and the struggle to preserve your humanity in this electronic age. It would be really followed up on Gary Numan's next album, Telecon, that came out in late 1980, which I loved, and there's a lot about the struggle with technology, and it went to #1 in Britain. It was quite successful. Gary Numan has had a long career pioneering various aspects of dark wave electronic, various electronic music genres, and he's still quite successful in doing that. It's not as big as Cars was, but it's still doing a lot. So I love this record because one of the things that makes me think about is, what do we mean when we say soul? What does it mean? We think of soul as a African American genre, but I remember when I worked in the record store and we had a rock section and a soul section, sometimes I felt conflicted. Like, Van Morrison? Is Van Morrison rock or is Van Morrison soul? Maybe because he's Irish and the Irish have been oppressed. There's a little bit of connection there. But, how do we sort of racially segregate music genres? And is it possible that in the complete absence of the soul affect, the way we think of it, the way we think about the country affect, like there's a twang and you're like, oh, that's a country singer, I can tell by the way they sing. In the complete absence of that affect, is there in fact soul? Because that's the theme of Newman's music during this period, is the human being is existing in the face of this electronic world that wants to erase the human being, the kind of iRobot thing about where technology takes over. And one of the things that I think is a great reason to talk about this record right now is because that's what AI is doing. AI is attempting, or may be seen as attempting, to erase our role in society, as more and more of our jobs and more of our ideas and more of our relationships are generated by artificial intelligence. I mean, people have AI girlfriends now. And I have students that instead of writing something, just go to AI and they let the AI do the work. And so this is kind of prophetic in the picture of the world that Gary Numan presented to us in 1979, is that the machine erases the person. I mean, this is really worth going back to, the melodic elements of these songs, especially films, and the drumming for films is popped up in a lot of hip-hop records because it's just so great. Observer, Engineers. I mean, these are all sort of these one-word titles. Airplane, Metal, Complex, Films, ME, which is Mechanical Engineer. Tracks, Observer, Conversation, Cars, Engineers. Is all about sort of the shrinking role of humans in the world of the machine. So, ahead of its time. Man, this record is so ahead of its time. And I wanted to talk about it because I think it's even more relevant now. Gary Numan, Pleasure Principle, 1979. The Pleasure Principle, again, you know, the id is our human desire and drive going to be able to exist in a world dictated by rationality and algorithms? It's a good question, Gary. Love this album. Still freaks me out a little bit, but I think you should give it a spin. So next time we're going to talk about an album that I think a lot of people thought I would have talked about right at the beginning for reasons that some of you will understand. We're going to talk about the Electric Light Orchestra's 1976 album, A New World Record. A lot of people know why this record is so important to me, but it is a truly great album that I want to spend a little bit of time on, and maybe a little book chat as well. You know, Gary Numan, I'm so glad Gary Numan is still making cool music. He's just got such a trajectory. His career has just gone all over the place. But this artist matters. He had something to say in 1979 that few of us listened to. That heeded the sort of clarion call that there's something coming that may threaten humanity itself. As dark as that may seem, underneath it, there's this need for love, and that's why the violas come in so nicely on this record. So Gary Numan is an artist that matters. This album matters. It kind of matters even more now than when it came out. And you matter. You matter. You, the human being, not the machine. You matter. So let's talk about it.